Welcome back to another episode of the Meat Mafia podcast. If this is your first time joining us, we have one goal and one goal only, and that is that you, yes, you, listen to this podcast and get at least one valuable piece of information that inspires you to go radically change your health today. If this is your second, third, fourth, or 100th time listening to the Meat Mafia podcast, we are so grateful to have you, and we are so thankful for your continued support. Before we get going, if you would not mind going and following us on all of our platforms, YouTube, Instagram, TikTok, Facebook, and of course, Twitter, we would greatly appreciate it. This just allows us to expand our reach, and your reviews, comments, and feedback give us more and more things to think about and improve the show with. Lastly, this is a user-supported podcast and newsletter, and we would not be able to do what we love doing without your generous support and the support from our sponsors. We take great pride in the relationships that we've built with our sponsors and truly believe that they are the best resources out there for better health. Your support and their support, and you supporting them, means the world to us. If you are enjoying the podcast and getting value out of it, please check us out on the Fountain app below, where you can support us by streaming us sats or sending us support via our Fountain Bitcoin wallet. Without further ado, here is a word from our sponsors. This episode of the podcast is brought to you by the Carnivore Bar. The Carnivore Bar is a veteran-owned, animal-based company focused on bringing you the highest quality pemmican product on the market. Pemmican is an ancient tradition practiced by American indigenous cultures, and it's focused on simple ingredients: beef, tallow, and salt. It's built for grab-and-go snacking, and it's a great sort of travel, hiking, or school lunch snack. And it's really built for those long-lasting days where you can just run on basically no fuel other than just simple fats. It's rich in saturated fats and provides everything you need to sustain long-lasting energy throughout the busy day. In my opinion, this is a product that is an absolute must, so go check it out in the link below. Also, check out our podcast with the founder, Philip Meese. He does an incredible job breaking down the mission and the passion behind the company. And I think if you're interested in animal-based nutrition, Philip will inspire you with his product. This episode of the podcast is also brought to you by Holy Cow Beef. Holy Cow Beef is regeneratively raised, grass-fed, grass-finished beef raised right here in Lubbock, Texas. Regeneratively raised, grass-fed, grass-finished beef is the gold standard of beef, and Ann and Weldon Warren have made it their lives' mission to provide incredibly high-quality beef to their local community and beyond. They have been raising their animals this way for decades. In fact, they were some of the most influential voices for getting grass-fed and grass-finished beef in Whole Foods back when Whole Foods was a startup grocery store. They were influential in setting the AGA standards, which is the American Grass-Fed Association, so you know they are doing things the right way, and on top of all of that, their beef tastes like butter. Grass-fed, grass-finished beef provides a superior omega-3 to omega-6 ratio than your typical beef, or in other words, it causes less inflammation in your body. So you are promoting a high protein, high fat diet with this amazingly high quality beef, and saturated fats are playing their critical role in benefiting your body through supporting hormonal functions and cellular functions. And if you're looking for the highest quality beef, look no further than Holy Cow Beef. Leave your butcher box, that Australian and New Zealand raised meat, in the cart and order from your friends Ann and Weldon Warren over at Holy Cow Beef. I almost forgot the most important part there. Ann and Weldon Warren also accept Bitcoin as payment, so go check them out at their website in the link below, and you can pay in Bitcoin or in cash if you're looking to save your Bitcoin. I don't know about you all, but I am all about rewriting the incentives when it comes to healthcare, and Crowd Health is doing just that. Crowd Health is essentially crowdfunding for healthcare with a small HSA component mixed in. Paying through the nose for health insurance you may never use, only to be turned away when you actually need it, is incredibly frustrating. Also, the exorbitant costs of health insurance has so many baked in premiums that when you compare settling your doctor's bills by paying in cash versus using insurance, the cost is astronomical. So crowdfunding allows you to settle your medical bills in cash and then get the funding you need from your group through Crowd Health. This is a great alternative to health insurance for people who are low risk, healthy people who just want peace of mind knowing that if anything actually did happen, they do have a pool of funds to pull from to cover their medical costs. The best part, my group is saving a portion of the monthly opt-in in Bitcoin, and the rest is in cash. So those savings are going towards actually preserving long-term value for my group through a vehicle like Bitcoin. We are really excited about this concept, and since the business model is predicated on an incentive-based healthcare, it is a great concept. For people with low risk, minimal healthcare costs, it is a no-brainer. Go check them out in the link below and use our promo code MAFIA for a discount on your first 6 months with Crowd Health. You guys are doing so many cool things. It's inspiring to look at it from the outside in, because it seems like you guys are putting out so much good content, but then underneath the hood, you guys are really like executing on it and really putting together these supply chains that are truly regenerative and educating people alongside. It's like a healthy balance of putting the product out there and teaching people like, hey, this is what really good food looks like. So we're excited just to have you on to unpack what you guys are doing over at Force of Nature and dive deeper into some of these topics.
Thanks, man. Yeah, thanks for saying that, and thanks for having me on. It's that's what we're trying to do. It's funny, we're doing this is mid-January right now. We're doing annual reviews and stuff, and talking to some of my the folks that were founding team members, original employees of ours, and it's like, holy crap, we're not faking it till we make it anymore. Like, we're actually out kind of tip of the spear and leading some of this stuff. And man, we got a long ways to go. We're not perfect, but it's really cool to see a lot of it coming together.
Yeah, it's special for us to have you in here too, because we were kind of running the numbers before you came to sit down with us, because we think a lot with this show just about brand and vision and messaging that we want to put out there. And the Force of Nature brand is something that has like personally meant a lot to the both of us too. Like when I was going on my carnivore journey, I was ordering from you guys. I was eating a ton of your meat. Collectively, we've been to 3 bison harvests. We went to the What Good Shall I Do conference. And it's just been cool to see this whole progression to go from we were consumers of your product. Like now we feel like we know so many people that work at the Force of Nature team and are just so impressed by everything that you all have built out there. So I'm sure you're probably incredibly proud of that.
Oh man, that's cool. Yeah, we are. We're super proud. And it was just weird too. Some of the random, mentions and call outs we get on social media now from, people that you look up to or knew or, wherever they may come from. Seems like they're coming out of the woodwork. And again, we're still small, right? In the grand scheme of things, but it's awesome to see the hard work starting to pay off and some of the vision come to fruition and, to see positive things coming out of it, right? Yeah. Like even in starting the company, like meat is such a screwed up industry, right? I mean, it's been such a race to the bottom for so long, and so many compromises and concessions at the expense of land and animal welfare and rural communities and health and wellness of consumers. And, I surveyed some of my mentors in the space to say, hey, if we do this, here's this idea. If we do this, are we just going to be further centralizing? Are we just going to be doubling down on the same flawed approaches and, challenges that have been introduced into this industry in the past? Or is this something you really think that it has legs? And, my mind it does, but I'm not exactly objective on it, right? I'm sort of extremely biased. And so, it's good to see that those fears not materializing, right? Like we actually are, again, like we're not perfect. We have shortcomings and we got shit we got to do better, but to see it growing to the point that it has, and to have the positive impact, and to be lifting up and parts of and contributing to the beneficial momentum of the industry around us, and the awareness and an awakening of consumers is really exciting. And that's what it's about. That's what it's about for us. It's not about perfection. It's about progress and making sure that bar constantly raises. And so I feel really good about what we've been able to do with in the scrappy approach and the limited time we've had.
Could you maybe take us back to day 0 of starting Force of Nature, and really just where you guys were drawing inspiration from for starting the company, and really why your guys' mission is so important to you? Because clearly the mission just comes across so clearly with the brand. But what were you guys thinking when you were starting it, and how has that unfolded since you started?
Day zero, goes back probably more to the Epic days, right? And so I know that you've had Taylor on, and he's told probably a fair bit of that story. I hate to get too redundant there, but it was a really powerful mission, and it was an important journey and road that we went down to get into to learn how important meat was to a healthy diet, and what better meat looks like, and what the challenges in the industry are, and what solutions to those challenges could be like, and the realities versus the myths, and all of the nuance to it. And I think we feel really proud about what we did with Epic, and in selling it, and eventually handing the reins over to General Mills and seeing them kind of, do what big food does and not be a perfect representation of that, but they didn't adulterate it, and then what we were doing was really good, and good at that sort of scale is fantastically good. It's really fucking good, right? And so seeing what them help put regenerative on the map with the commitment to convert 1 million acres of their supply chain and get glyphosate out of Cheerios and things like that was really important and powerful. But we couldn't get our heads out. We couldn't get out of our heads this idea that, like, why is nobody doing this with meat? Like, we're just a snack product, we do a couple ounces at a time. Like, somebody should be driving this sort of change in pounds at a time. And you kind of went and looked into the industry, and there's all these industry terms that you look at, what is your household penetration? Like, how many people are actually eating bars, right? And how frequently, like, what's the velocity of the product and stuff? And meat is insane. It's in something like 98% of households, and people eat it 2 to 3 times a day, and it's just those numbers don't happen anywhere else in the food space. And we're like, wow, if we could really penetrate that market with this message. And the other thing too is, like, we were building supply chains and working with food producers and land stewards and processors, and it's like, they're good people. They want to be better. Like, so many of them almost feel handcuffed into being a part of a system that is adverse to their own best interests, right? And counter to the direction they want to be taking their own family's legacy and generational wealth in the form of their land and what they do and the service that they provide, and what their identity is, so closely tied into. And, the system and the industry doesn't give them that opportunity to break out and do that. And so, for us, it was like, holy cow, like, number one, nobody's doing, like, really amplifying and building a national brand that's focused on content and education and really igniting a consumer revolution and a food movement in a way that we think that people are doing it. But I think that's a gift. That's a strength that we have to give to the industry that I think we can help the many other good actors and good players out there with, right? And to do it and to address some of those other things, and to, give hope to these communities that have been, had hope taken from them, I think was another big kind of idea behind, like, hey, starting companies is, there's people always talk about, like, the ones that work and have the glitz and glamour, and, like, oh, can you believe so? And it's like, but most of them fail. Like, 1 in 10,000 will make it to, $1 million or something like that, right? Easy. And and of those, and only 1 in 10,000 will make it 5 years, and so it's just, we had to convince ourselves that we actually wanted to do it again, because it's really hard. But the mission itself and the vision we have for it, was too important, and we felt like we were poised uniquely to give it a shot. And if we do nothing else but kick the door open for somebody else and create momentum for a rising tide, and we don't end up, Force of Nature's not here in 5 years, so be it, right? But it's worth the effort.
When you, Taylor, and Katie set out to actually start Force of Nature, did you have the intention in mind that you all were going to be building an entirely new regenerative supply chain? Or was it more so you went out and surveyed a bunch of these other farms and understood what the meat industry actually was and said, oh shit, we actually going to have to build a new supply chain because this regenerative system just doesn't really exist in a way that we wanted to?
I think it was, kind of a little of both.
Okay.
We already had been building a regenerative supply chain. So part of it for us was, like, we can leverage the work we've already done to get off the ground and get started. But the scale of regenerative, I mean, heck, when we started with Epic, the scale of grass-fed was tiny. That's grown considerably, but the scale of regenerative was a whisper. I mean, nobody had heard of it, right? And so, we knew there was an opportunity to create supply that didn't exist before, but we also knew, and I think almost more importantly, that there was a ton of supply out there already that didn't have access to a market. And so it's facilitation of that supply chain and connecting consumers to producers that are like-minded, consumers that are willing to pay a premium for something that aligns with their values and addresses things that they're concerned about and makes them feel healthy and well, but also good about the system that they're supporting and complicit in, the benefits or challenges of. And then the same thing on the producer front, right? Making sure that they're finally getting rewarded for what they may already be doing. So I think it's, I can't take credit for manifesting the magic of regenerative, supply chain, but I think we're really proud of what we've been able to do to help make that connection, right? And start to build, more of a pool. If we create more demand for regenerative, that helps us, but it helps the industry. It helps all those producers with whether they have different labels or whether they're in different regions or whether they have different proteins and like whatever it is, again, our goal is to create a rising tide. And so, we're talking about potentially, depending on how you look at the numbers, $100 billion industry, right? Like, we have a long-term goal. Like, our moonshot goal is, maybe one day force of nature can achieve 1% share. Right? That's good enough, and that's outrageously high anyway, right? That'd be massive. We don't need to take over the industry, right? But if we could do that, the ripple effect would be so massive.
Absolutely.
And it would mean there's other regenerative minded and focused producers, processors, brands. There's a supply chain. There's access. There's efficiency getting created where it's somewhat punitive now. Probably regulatory speaking, there's incentives that didn't exist previously that continue to make this mismatch between pricing that you see on the shelf and the true cost of food. That's if you really were to weigh in the externalities and the true accounting of food, right? We could start to level the playing field some in so many ways. And so, sorry, I kind of went on a tangent there, but I think it's all really important. It all ties in.
Equip's unflavored prime has one single ingredient derived directly from grass-fed beef protein. For purists like ourselves who try to only consume balanced, real sources of nutrition, this protein powder checks all the boxes. Go check them out in the link below and use our promo code in the description to get a discount. Do you guys view your role as kind of helping define regenerative? Because I think as these movements grow, I look at like the keto movement. It's like as they grow, the definition or like the window for what it means can kind of change and drift. And I think like right now is such a unique moment in time. It's so early on in the regenerative movement, and just like establishing the range of what regenerative really means, I think is probably really important for a lot of people.
No, I don't think defining regenerative. I mean, there's a lot of people have already defined regenerative and they've been working on it for decades, right? And I think regenerative as a concept is also really, it's huge and it's complex and confusing even for the experts, and even the experts don't agree, right? And I think it would be more for me trying to be a good steward for the vision of it and try to fight against and avoid some of the temptations of greenwashing. And I think the other thing I would say is trying to be a uniting force. I think of what's happened in higher attribute agriculture as kind of a tragedy to some extent, and not necessarily all because of external factors, right? I mean, there's some component of a circular firing squad. We all agree who's big and bad. But we have one minor difference of opinion on one subset of things, and it's like, boom, trying to take each other off at the knees. Right. And it's like, there will never be this surge, this groundswell if there can't be collaboration and agreement to disagree and work together and recognize that like the little guys got to align and work together to actually make progress and overcome the big guys. So, I think the definition of regenerative matters. It matters a lot. It's extremely different whether you're talking about poultry or whether you're talking about beef or whether you're talking about something else. And it's complex when you get to like, what about the net impact when you look into the supply chain of feed and you look at how far did it travel? And there's nothing that's perfect about it. And I think the other thing about the importance of defining regenerative is there has to be a standard. There has to be it can't be hollow, and it can't just be a marketing term that means nothing, like natural. Right. On the flip side, what consumer is going to really understand not understand what regenerative is, right? But, I get this a lot, like, oh, the challenge that you face is going to be educating all these consumers on what regenerative is. And it's like, well, how many consumers of the 70 or 80% of consumers that bought an organic item last year, how many of them can recite the organic standard?
Less than
handful.
5%.
Right. Way less than 5%.
Yeah.
Right.
Less than 1%, probably.
Yeah. And it's not to say that doesn't matter. It does. It drives accountability and it creates the opportunity for regulation and consistency. So those things matter. But what matters at the end of the day is the consumer. And what the consumer needs to understand is that there's this opportunity and there's this system out there that is significantly better. It's better than organic. And it's better at delivering what they're looking for in their food. And the thing that regenerative does is it offers a little bit of something to almost everybody, right? Whether we have vegan customers that are buying stuff for their animals, you know what I mean? Because they recognize, you could be a conservationist, you could be, trying to, start a family and want to nourish your family the best possible way. It could be that you're hunting into the wildlife and want to see the native systems improved. I mean, there's so many reasons, performance athlete, whatever it might be. There's so many reasons why that we have like a draw to somebody say, hey, check it out. I have something that you'll find interesting and valuable. And oh, by the way, while we have your attention, like, hey, let me expose you to some other things you might find compelling, such that you not only begin to advocate for this sort of a system, but maybe even in time tip over into being an evangelist for like getting your friends and being that true, thought leader and helping the groundswell.
I love what you were saying earlier about the hidden, I think you called it the hidden cost of food, because I remember very clearly when I first went carnivore, going to the grocery store, and I just didn't have knowledge on the different types of beef and the different micronutrient content. In my perspective, it's like beef is just calories, protein, and fat. So why am I going to pay $10 for the Force of Nature ground beef when I can just go to the local grocery store and there's $5 ground beef too? I didn't understand this whole hidden cost. It's interesting how we're almost just trained by society to view the upfront cost of the beef, but not all these other things that are going on behind the scenes. And I'm sure that's probably something that you're and the team are really passionate about. Is just how do we educate people to really understand, what is the cost of good food, and the fact that you might be paying a little bit cheaper on the front end, but there is some cost that's associated with that.
Yeah, we were talking about that before we kicked off too, because Taylor and I did a whole podcast on the Where Hope Grows podcast on the true cost of food, and I think your point is a good one, and I would add the other side of it too is like what is the extremely high cost of really cheap food,
Yes.
right? And I think that $5 option that you referenced, right, probably more likely costs $20,
yes,
right? When you factor in healthcare costs, when you factor in, that it's contributing to a system, when you factor in, loss of fertility and desertification on land, when you factor in that there's hundreds of billions of dollars going into a farm bill that supports and props up, some pretty inefficient systems, and when you factor in, what's the cost of having excess supply and excess demand simultaneously of food, because one plant and an extremely efficient but hyper fragile system goes down, and all of a sudden you can't process meat anymore. And now consumers don't have access to meat. I mean, there's costs to all of these things, whether it's taxpayers, whether it's consumers, again, quality of life and reduced life or health spans, and so on and so forth. That doesn't ever factor in on that shelf price.
Yes.
And then there's the confusion of like what we think, where we think there's value and where we think there's not value, right? And like our most expensive item that people think is, it's super premium. It's extremely expensive within the industry, all relatively speaking, from a price point perspective. But 60 cents an ounce for like regenerative ancestral beef or bison or something like that versus $1.19 an ounce for Ruffles.
Yeah.
We don't think in terms of that like that though.
Right? Or candy, or or the same thing with a Hershey bar, over $1 an ounce. And how much do you pay for wine and olive oil? How much do you pay for a freaking bottle of water? You know what I mean? Like, we're just throwing money at stuff, and you can take, you've been on carnivore, like the value and what you get from a satiation standpoint, what you get from a macro and micronutrient and phytonutrient profile from really good meat. You can take a pound of meat and a couple dollars of frozen vegetables and feed a family of 4 for like $15. You can't feed one person at Chick-fil-A for $15.
Mm-hmm.
Nobody complains about those prices though, or those costs, right? And so how we've been conditioned socially to think about what is cheap and what isn't, what's expensive and what's not. And it's like, holy crap, this is the cornerstone of our diet, the cornerstone of our plate. And this is where we're going to be cutting corners.
Mm. You mentioned the Farm Bill. And when I learn more and more about the different subsidies that are out there that exist in the legacy system, it's really propping up kind of what you guys are working to unpack and recreate into a new system. How do you think about what exists today in terms of subsidies? And do you think there's a chance that there are some subsidies out there for the regenerative movement in the long term that can help fuel the growth of this movement?
Yeah, I think I would be an advocate for overhauling the Farm Bill, right? And I mean, I think one of the things, when you look at what's going on broadly and geopolitically, right, one of the great strengths that we're fortunate to have here in the United States is the ability to produce food and produce our own food. You know, one of the sad realities is that we stopped producing as much of it, and we stopped producing the diversity of it and the mix of it that we once had the potential, and we stopped. We're no longer a nation of farmers that we once were, right? We used to be. I mean, even at the turn of in the early 1900s, it would have been, I think it was like some 20% farmers, and now we're some 2 or 3%, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so, you know, I think some of these changes are fine. They're good. And progress happens, but some of them aren't. So, right. I think we've all looked at and seen the challenge of relying on foreign nations for supply chains, and like, what do we really want to be relying? How reliant do we want to be on foreign nations for fertilizers or for food, right? When we have this potential internally, and if we value it correctly, and we appreciate it in the way that we should, I think that the reward and the incentive could be there, right? And I think we're also incentivizing through the current system some really bad behavior, right? I mean, it's sort of like our sick care system, mm-hmm. right? We are incentivizing farmers not to make progress, not to take care of their land in the way that they know they could or should, to till too much, or to overproduce something that doesn't need to be overproduced necessarily, right? And inversely, we're penalizing or treating punitively folks who step out of that mold, who aren't controlled and absolutely under the thumb of the federal program. As soon as you step out of that, things get really hard. Like, you can't get crop insurance if you don't spray. So those sorts of things, right? And it's like, well, there's research that shows that spraying for pests, to eliminate undesirable species of pests actually increases the amount of undesirable species of pests. So why would I want to spray?
Yeah.
Don't ask questions, just stick with it. And then it creates like they can barely make enough money, so they do it again, and they're just like, they're stuck in, and they're drawing down and down and down, which is why you see such a hopelessness that we referenced earlier. And we see, loss of land and centralization of land going to Bill Gates, but farmers that have been doing it for 5 generations can't afford to keep their land anymore, and kids aren't staying home because there's no point. The real virtue is in being a doctor or a lawyer and moving into a city and not staying on the land and serving your nation and serving your peers and the people around you who are grateful for the incredible work that you do to feed the nation. And, it's just the calculus is all screwed up. And so I think there's a ton of opportunity. I like what I'm seeing. I think, when we talk about regenerative agriculture, we get too reductionist around the concept of carbon. It's a big issue. It's popular. And so it's one that everybody gravitates towards. And so it's helpful to be able to present regenerative from that perspective. But you have the nutrient cycle that we talked about a little bit. You have the water cycle. You have, diversity and the health of land and ecosystems and wildlife. There's a lot of things that we should be looking at and incentivizing, and we can do that. And I think like carbon credits are an example of something where if they're continue to be, there's a long way to go. They're very early on, and if it becomes more standardized, more understandable, more folks become more experienced with it, there could be a sort of incentive there to reward the good actors in the space that create, that again, sorts to level that playing field. And they're looking at some of those same sort of programs with water, effective water infiltration rates and effective use of rainfall and helping recharge aquifers and stuff. And we could be looking at, the other ecosystem services we could be supporting through agriculture again, and increasing diversity of plant and animal species on lands and so on and so forth. Why not reward that if we're willing to pay for some other things.
Absolutely.
100%. Yeah, I know. When Taylor came on our show, he gave the statistic that 99% of Americans have never met their local farmer, which I thought that was, I had to like think about that a few times because that's such a high percentage. But when you think about it, it's definitely 100% true. And you guys posted something on Instagram, I think a few weeks ago, that I think really it really embodies your brand. And I think what you guys said was like, here are 3 great ways to actually source food. The first thing is to hunt your own food. The second thing is to connect with your local farmer and shake their hand and purchase from them. And then the third is that you then go to force of nature if you can't do one or two. And it makes me think about the fact, I think you had mentioned that out of the 100 billion, you guys are just looking to carve out like a very small portion of the pie, like maybe 1%. And it just makes me think about your overall mission where it's like, yes, of course you're a business, you want to be profitable, but you're really trying to push people to really identify with their food and connect with those local sources. So I just think that's such an amazing message.
Yeah, that's I mean, that's one that you were asking some of the other things that we've some of the other podcasts I've been on, and that's one that I've really resonated with. Like I'm not looking to just like centralize the meat system around force of nature, right? I mean, too many brands and companies have come along to try to centralize the meat system, and then we see what the result looks like. It looks like what Tyson's created, which is awful. Mm-hmm. I think for us, it's like we're trying to reclaim the legacy of meat, like we say in our tagline, right? We want to fight these the propaganda and the myths around that are attacking meat, and we want to call out where there's bad actors in meat. And shed some light on and pull the curtain back for consumers to understand, like, hey, this isn't really what I believe in the consumer, right? I believe that folks will take action when they're motivated and when they see where their value, where they're being misled, particularly, and where they're being sold something that is counter to what they believe it to be. And meat's a good example of that. The meat that most people are getting isn't what they think it is. Mm-hmm. That doesn't mean you should stop buying meat. It just means that you should stand up and say, hey, wait a minute, there's a better option. That's the option that I want, and help that movement to grow and that awareness to happen. I still think, like I said, there's no substitute for doing what all of our ancestors have done, and that's packing some gear and getting into the mountains for a few days and struggling your ass off and working hard and failing and figuring out like, oh shit, like, yeah, this isn't easy. Like, yeah, it's a luxury to have meat available to us, and then going out and actually getting that meat. Yeah, that's where you start. I mean, that's what it's all about. But that isn't available to everybody, unfortunately. And more and more people need to get in it. And there's a bunch of groups that are great out there that are helping to raise awareness to that and set those up. So more power to them. And then, like you said, that second avenue, it's not just local, right? Because local and doing all the things that are wrong and bad isn't really any better, other than there's a smaller, didn't travel as far, right? But like we should still be holding our local farmers and ranchers to the standard of like, hey, can you be practicing these principles of regenerative agriculture, and are you finishing them on grains, or are you finishing them on grass? And again, it's not to disparage local, but local and regenerative is better than just simply local, right? And so I would say if you have a really incredible regenerative operation nearby that's a neighbor, go there, get that, right? Absolutely. Don't be buying it from us to be shipped from somewhere or to be sourced from elsewhere and brought here. Go support the local regenerative operation, no doubt. But if you want to support better food systems and supply chains and those aren't options to you, then yeah, look to us. And there's others as well, but that's where we fit in the hierarchy of the best way to go out and nourish yourself. And then after that becomes, still eat meat, if you don't have access to one of those things, meat's still better. But that's when you start getting into further down that spectrum, you get to right back to where we started with the current system.
What sort of takeaways do you think people would have if they went out, they've never hunted before, but they went out and tried to go out and kill their own food and really like appreciate that connection with going and working for it for themselves, and just doing the hard work that it takes to put food on the table?
What do I think that they're
like? What do you think their takeaway would be? Or I know you're a hunter, so that's why I'm asking. It's not many people have gone out into the wilderness and made that kill and put food on the table that they've actually taken their life from.
I think they'd figure out how much of a luxury it is to have access to what we have access to on a regular and daily basis. We don't have to suffer for anything. We just walk walk any direction, pick your point of direction and walk far enough that way. And there's an abundance of food for you there. And that's a real luxury that never existed in human history for all intents and purposes. I think besides, the trial and tribulation of hunting, I think they'd pretty quickly get to that kill shot moment, and they'd realize, they'd start to feel an energy that they hadn't maybe felt before when you're, at the cusp of taking something's life. It's Steve Rinella wrote a quote in his book, American Buffalo. I love it. And I don't know it. And I'm not going to even attempt to recite it. But one thing he said is it's an amalgamation of emotions. And amongst them, he lists it's excitement. There's sorrow. There's some, like, after you take the shot, there's regret. There's just so many things that you experience. And I really do think part of that is tapping into some of our roots, some of our DNA, some of our, like a sixth sense of sorts, where we're actually connecting with the food. And I know it sounds weird to say you're connecting with the food as you're killing it, but you are. I mean, that is what life on this planet is. It's life, death, decay, new life. There is a cycle, and we are part of that cycle. And it takes things dying, whether it's plants or animals, for us to continue. And we've lost connection with that. And so I think in that moment we learn things. And I think one of the big takeaways for me, and I thought about this when we did the first bison harvest at Rome Ranch, and and I shot the first animal, and I had to write a blog about it. And I'm like, what is going on? And I've shot lots of things in my life. Why am I stressing this so hard? And what's, I like doing practice reps of shooting and going over it and trying to structure it and set it up. And I think the conclusion I came to is it's like, we are all complicit in whatever food system that we support. And I don't know why that moment like kind of clicked the light bulb for me, but like we're all always behind the trigger. Like It doesn't matter if you actually go hunt and kill something and you pull the trigger, or you run over to whatever your local convenient or your local conventional grocery store is, and you buy something in plastic wrap. Like, there was a living animal, it died so that you could do that. You're a part of it. You did it. You have to take ownership of it. You have to accept it. And I think that it's easy to lose that connection and to distance yourself from that reality and that understanding whenever we have the conveniences and the luxury that we do. But in that moment, when you're in the field, you have to connect it, you have to face it, you have to own it. And I think there's a lot of value in that, because it gives you an unbelievable respect, a reverence, and appreciation for the lives those animals live. And coming out of that, you understand, hey, I want to make sure that, as a consumer, I want to make sure that the system I'm supporting celebrates that life. Excuse me, celebrates that life, gives it the opportunity to realize its true potential in the world, in the life cycle of living things, and the circle of life, right? Mm-hmm. I want it to realize that potential to do good on the land and contribute its role and play its role and live its best life. And unfortunately, as humans, like, we have this capacity for empathy. Like, I want it to, I want to try to control all the variables that I can to make sure that when it necessarily takes the next leap in that circle, or transitions into the next phase of the circle of life, that we're being thoughtful and conscious about how we curate that moment and how it happens, and how we can eliminate harm and suffering and unneeded stress and those sorts of things. So I think that'd be, one of the big things I think folks would take away. And then again, like, on the back end of taking down an animal, you got to break it down, you got to process it, and then be like, what the hell do I do with this thing? And it's like, again, you have some luxuries, and that stuff, sourcing, finding that animal and sourcing it, taking that kill shot and then breaking it down and putting it on your plate. Like, there's a value in all of that whenever you go to the store and find it. And those people deserve to be rewarded for that labor and that love and that, and that burden they take on for you. Mm-hmm. And you should be paying a premium for that. You should want to pay a premium for that. You shouldn't look for meat to be the cheapest thing at the lowest price point in the entire grocery store. I'd flip that on its head. Like, why are we paying $30 a pound for almonds? We should be paying a premium for meat. Mm-hmm.
And to your point, Robby, something that you guys do such an amazing job of, and I know you touched on it, and Harry and I touched on it. We've probably spoken about it 20 plus times on the show, because it had such a huge impact on us, or the bison harvest that you guys are putting on out at Rome Ranch in Fredericksburg. And for someone like both of us, where we eat a lot of meat, we haven't gotten to get into hunting yet. It's a huge goal that we have. That's been the closest exposure that I've ever had to death. So just the feeling of showing up there and you passing the bullet around the circle and putting some positive energy into it and almost like thanking the bison for its life. And the people that you have there are trying to get the perfect shot to give it the cleanest death possible, down to the butchering process, down to you guys sending us home with a bunch of the meat, the heart, the liver, sending us home with ground beef. And you're looking at the bag in your fridge and saying to yourself, this animal was literally alive a few hours ago. I watched it die. I took part in that process. It's like impossible to not just feel this insane energy and appreciation. And it makes you want to like take in the animal and then go do incredible things with your life because you saw the effort that it took to actually get to that point. So for people that haven't hunted, I think it's just so cool that you are all willing to give people that experience to connect with death in a way that they never normally would be able to.
Yeah, I think too often hunting is confused with killing, right? And that's not the point at all.
Mm-hmm.
It's more about being human than anything else, right? And I think one of the cool things that I would add to those harvest experiences is the community. To be able to tap into that element of our past where we would celebrate the life of that animal, celebrate the transition of that animal and the potential it has to then nourish us and help us realize our potential, and do it in a community setting, right? Where it really would, historically, speaking, take a village to make these sorts of opportunities and to keep folks going. And again, that's another truth that we're starved for, especially in an age where, we're told to go into our houses and never leave.
Can you talk about some of the changes that you've seen with some of the farms that you work with, just in terms of having animal impact on the land and what people should understand from a consumer perspective of when things are done correctly? You mentioned that, it's not just carbon, it's water, it's all the mycelium network that's improving. Like, what sort of things does the consumer need to understand about having things done correctly on the land from a regenerative perspective that's happening on the back end that they're not going to see? Like what's happening on the farms over a long period of time from an environmental perspective that is like, yeah, this is creating value over a long period of time.
Oh man, there's so many things, and I don't know that I could claim credit for all of them, right? But I think when you're talking about the potential of regenerative agriculture and examples of that, and I think we'll look at that, and I think the other thing to look at is comparing that and giving a benchmark against the trajectory that we're on otherwise. And so I think I'll start with on the earth there's something like 30 billion acres of land, and not, I think most of that's not covered in ice, and about 11 billion of it is under management for agriculture. There's a lot of land, and you see that particularly in the United States. There's roughly 2 billion acres, give or take, and about 1 billion of that is, so about 50% of the land in the United States is being managed for agriculture. You see it when you fly in a plane, right? When you look down, it looks like a checkerboard.
Totally.
And so, we love the romance and the beauty of nature, but we're decimating it for these systems, and we don't have to, right? We could have food production systems that mirror nature. And the truth is, like, we're mining the productivity that nature gave us and instilled in these lands for some of these synthetic food production systems, like the chemical industrial monocrop agriculture lands that we always talk about. And so I think understanding the reality of that change, right? Understanding that, we're losing species left and right, and yet we have a potential to create habitat and restore the potential for diverse insects, animals, whatever, to thrive in our land and to produce an abundance of food is really important for us. I think, you can look at how much we're spraying on all of that land globally. I know 50% of the land globally, I think, is still subsistence farming, right? And so it's not all industrial, but when you're talking about 11 billion acres, that means roughly 5 or 6 billion acres is industrial. And so think about spraying that with herbicide, fungicide, pesticide, and knowing that maybe half of that, maybe 40% of it sticks, the rest of it runs off into waterways. And so now we're all testing positive for glyphosate in our urine and breast milk, and there's just unbelievable consequences that runs off into streams, causes algae blooms, kills streams, goes into oceans, causes dead zones in oceans. Like again, like we're losing ocean species left and right. Like these are all real things. And you look at carbon, 40% of the legacy load of carbon in the atmosphere is a result of tilling for agriculture.
Wow.
Because you're tilling up the dirt. We're all life is carbon based. You oxidize it, it releases into the atmosphere. And so like, it almost doesn't even matter what the issue is that you point to. It's like the uniting force behind so much of the negative outcomes, so many of the negative outcomes we're seeing is agriculture. And so we have an opportunity to do better. There is a system that we have proven through the ages. I mean, freaking Plato and Socrates and those guys write about the importance of soil health and farming and systems. And we've seen civilizations rise in these valleys and then grow up onto the walls of the valleys and then have one bad year and erosion occurs. And then all of a sudden they can't sustain their population. So they go and they create war to try to bring in resources from another area. And eventually they fail. And then that civilization collapses and declines. And then it recovers. And 1,000 years later, another group of humans move into that valley and do the same. You know what I mean? Like this isn't a new lesson. Yeah. This isn't age old. This lesson's as old as time, or at least as old as the human species. And I think if you look at, but for the first time in history, we're a global civilization. And you look at topsoil, we rely on topsoil. Like that's what all life comes from. It's this thin little tiny layer over the crust of the earth. And the system that we're advocating to become the most prevalent system is losing outrageous amounts of topsoil every single year. Billions of tons. I think I saw. I don't want to quote it because somebody could Google it themselves, but the numbers are outrageous, and up to and including our biggest export in the United States is topsoil. It goes into through wind and rain and erosion. It goes into the ocean. We're losing it, and it takes over 500 years to make an inch of topsoil, and we need it to survive. And so, it is a finite resource, and it is one that we are losing at a rapid pace. That has to stop, or we will not be able to produce food. And again, this system addresses that, and it actually builds topsoil, and it builds topsoil faster than nature if we manage it correctly. So that's the reality. Now, why else should what are some examples of it working? You look at you look at the United States and many regions. I mean, there's so many eco regions, but many areas you'd say like the average soil carbon level or soil organic matter level would be like, I don't know, somewhere between 6 and 9%, 6 and 8%. And many of our industrial farmlands are down below 1%, below 0.5% organic matter. So again, that's part of that carbon of the legacy load, right? You think about billions of acres and multiply that by how many layers deep. All that carbon is now in the atmosphere. The problem is you need that carbon in the soil to maintain food production, right? Like that's what makes roots and the rhizosphere and all of the beautiful complexity and the romantic dance in nature that biology that happens underground that allows us to upcycle from soil to plants and from plants to animals and so on. It also, 1% organic matter over an acre has the potential to assist that acre in retaining 20,000 gallons of water. So it becomes this sort of water storage area, right? And we always hear about droughts and floods and the issues that they cause. Well, when you don't have organic matter, you can't make effective use of rainfall. I mean, it won't penetrate, it'll run off and cause floods. You do have organic matter, it infiltrates and it holds in the land, and then you can withstand droughts. So there's like tremendous examples like that. Gabe Brown up in the Dakotas has some examples where he shows that he can infiltrate water at like upwards of 15 inches of rain an hour, rainfall rate, right? Like most ag land that's bare dirt won't infiltrate an inch of rain. It'll almost all run off if they get it in a heavy enough downpour. And you look at, Will Harris and White Oak Pastures, right? Bringing species back to an area that they didn't exist. And his example, a great example there would be bald eagles. Mm-hmm. And you look at, I think the other, another example though, and I'll go past the land and talk about communities, right? I mean, I think folks that are doing regenerative well are stacking revenue streams, and they're creating resiliency in their operations. So they're not just making soybeans and corn depending on the time of year. They're having multiple crops with animals integrated into that operation and doing a bunch of different things. So they're making more money per acre and more food per acre than the industrial conventional system that you'd compare them to. That's giving them more opportunity to stay on the land, more justification to be a better land steward for the land and for the future. I think there's a major tragedy there in rural America with the loss of farmers and their farmland.
When we talk about farmers, I was just curious just how that process goes for you and the team at Force of Nature when you're trying to find a new farmer, rancher, producer to source your meat from. When they meet you, are they happy? Is there skepticism? I'm just kind of curious, like how they kind of interpret what you're doing when you're having some of those earlier conversations about you actually sourcing from them.
I don't think that there's any skepticism. I think by the time we're having conversations with somebody, there's been probably a mutual vetting process. I think generally we're met with, I think maybe early on when we hadn't built the brand and the name, sort of like, geez, are you sure you're going to try to do all that?
Yeah.
Good luck. I mean, I've heard that before. If people have tried to make change in this industry before, I think now it's met with more enthusiasm, right? Like they want, as I mentioned earlier, they want to do better. They want to. There's a vision that they have for their land that they're limited in being able to pursue based off of the market that they have access to. And if we can help them get access to a consumer that's willing to pay a premium and help their peers and help the long-term stability of what they're doing in their operation and help them justify taking the next step and raising the bar just a little bit more, or giving them a little bit more diversity in customer base, so they have, they're hedged against, potentially losing one customer or another. I mean, I think generally speaking, they're excited to be working with us and want to keep it that way.
Yeah, and I'm sure that's a special feeling too if you're coming across a rancher a few years ago and they're saying, "Oh, this sounds great, Robby, but I've heard this before." And now for you to be sitting here a few years later and actually be delivering on those promises, I mean, I would imagine that feels really good for you too.
Yeah, I mean, that's part of what it's all about, right? I mean, I think our mission is to serve producers and consumers, and you can't support one without the other. And so I think a lot of our messaging and brand work and copy and content that we put out highlights the folks on the front lines, and those are the front lines, and I think we point a lot back to farms and ranches because it's the consumer that is going to really be the catalyst in a food movement, right? Mm-hmm. Nobody's going to produce a product that a consumer won't buy. And so if we can help create awareness, I say create access and awareness, create awareness of the issue, of key issues that are out there, and create access to an opportunity to do something about it, then they can cast a vote. That sends a signal, and so on and so forth. So we focus a lot on trying to get the attention of the consumer, but the truth is, like, that only helps create more of a pool, more demand, which allows us to go back to the front lines and work with those folks and support them in what they're doing.
Mm. We were lucky enough you mentioned Will Harris at White Oak Pastures. We recently did a road trip back east for Christmas, and we stopped at White Oak Pastures. And one of the stats he talked about was the age of farmers being somewhere in the range of like 60 years old or older. Are you guys seeing a resurgence or interest from younger people getting into farming and starting to think about these new systems from like a fresh perspective? Like, hey, if we're going to start new, let's start with this regenerative model that we can get behind and bring all these different layers to the conversation, not just about, providing high quality food, but restoring the ecosystem and playing our part in that role as well.
I think definitely, yes. I think there's definitely movement in that direction. I mean, there's a sort of renaissance seemingly taking place. I think generally speaking, folks are looking to move away from population centers and move out into more or less crowded areas. I mean, those tend to be the rural areas. And I think also there's a love and a romance and a recognition that we've really gone far down into this like synthetic reality, this artificial reality that we call everyday life. You know, I mean, what are big cities, but in some ways like human CAFOs, and in a weird and distorted, but also truthful way. And I think the idea of getting back on the land, you know, whether it's, you know, being the term's escaping me, but you know, a lot of folks like trying to live off the land and, you know, moving into tiny homes and celebrating reduction in their consumer behavior, and leaving prosperous careers and you know, very white collar professional service or industry oriented areas to like going and doing something hard with their bare hands and getting dirty and sweating. I think there's a lot of folks that are interested in that. Not enough yet to make up for the loss that you know, the age difference, that, you know, the person being over the age of 60, not having a next generation, all those sorts of things. So we got a ways to go if we really want the people producing our food to be our neighbors, to be other citizens that have our best interest in mind and their best interest in mind, and not solely their profit interest in mind, like Bill Gates. And I think one of the big challenges there too is the cost of land. I mean, there's just a major imbalance, right? Yeah. It's extremely difficult to buy land at its current cost, and then embark on that journey and that learning curve. And so I think there's, you know, not just people expressing an interest in that transition, but I think that there's groups working on, okay, how can I help with training for these folks? How can I help them get access to funding and debt? Or how can we help it, make it where they don't have to buy the land, but they can come and work and be on the land and live on the land and work on the land, and the person who owns the land gets the benefit. You know what I mean? And so I think there's a lot of service, like not-for-profit and service groups coming in to try to help be like facilitators of that transition and change. So it's extremely encouraging, and I think it, you know, it should be something that gives us all a great deal of hope. But we do have a long way to go. You know, and again, we were, you know, if you go from a 30-year population being farmers to, you know, less than, you know, a few single digit percentage points, you know, there's a lot of recovery there. The average size of a farm goes from, you know, maybe a few acres to a few hundred acres to a few thousand acres. Like there's a lot of change there to unwind.
Right. Yeah. You've mentioned Bill Gates a few times, and I'm just curious, you know, what is your confidence level in us being able to correct a lot of the nutritional misinformation that exists around meat and red meat consumption in general?
I mean, I'm very confident. Mm-hmm. You know, I think as long as there's access to free speech, yeah, in the digital age, then you know, the truth will be available. And I think there's a whole, you know, I think one of the things that's interesting is there's so much money and interest in promoting the misinformation around meat and food and what is and isn't healthy, and diet and, you know, lifestyle. I just saw something recently that like whatever the government and group was, I think it was the CDC, saying like for obese children, like some of the top recommendations by the professional bodies are like surgery and medication. It's like,
I saw that.
What the fuck? What about diet and lifestyle? Holy shit. But you know, as long as like folks can look at that and say, this is ridiculous, you know, call it for what it is, total propaganda bullshit. And I think we're seeing more and more of that. Right. And I think the truth behind the food system is one that's compelling for almost everybody. And again, there's that draw. There's something about regenerative agriculture and a better approach and a better system that's more, it's more about winning across a broader group of stakeholders, right? Mm-hmm. The land, the animals, the people on all ends. I think folks like that, you know? Yeah. And I think that will prevail. You know, folks like what y'all are doing, giving me this opportunity, and y'all have been a champion for this message in your own right as well. You know, I just see that happening more and more. And I think I mentioned it a second ago, but you know, when we learned about regenerative and began down our journey, like nobody knew what it was. Nobody knew, let alone how to say it, right? Mm-hmm. Nobody had heard of it. And I just saw a report. I mean, this is anecdotal. I think it was like Salon Magazine, so you know, whatever. But they did a survey of 1,000 consumers, and I don't know the demographics, but it said something along the lines of 60 or 70% of consumers were familiar with organic, but only 17% of consumers were familiar with regenerative. And my take on that was, holy shit, 17% of consumers are aware of what regenerative is. And then it said something like 14 or 15% of them were highly likely to pay a premium for regenerative. And I'm like, damn, it was only a small number of years ago where this was an unheard of concept. And to reach that many people at this pace is well ahead of the pace that organic, which began in, kind of the 70s and 80s and really became to prominence in the early 2000s before getting to where it is now. And so I feel like it is growing at an incredible pace. And I feel like meat is a necessary part of the conversation around regenerative, right? Like it's all about plants and animals in common in balance. So
totally.
You can tell how much that you trust the process too, because we were texting at a side conversation yesterday, and I was like, I went to this burger restaurant in Austin. Harry and I went there, and they're ordering meat from you guys, but like I think they're still cooking in seed oils, and you're like, slow down, buddy. It's like first step is great. They're starting to be more intentional about where they source their meat from, and it's a process. Like eventually, we'll hopefully be able to get them to correct and cook with tallow and animal fats. But it seems like you have that approach of like one step at a time and trusting that process, and eventually we can get there.
Well, and it kind of goes back to what I was talking about, even within the meat industry and folks being too quick to try to villainize folks who should otherwise be their allies, right? Like we cannot throw the baby out with the bathwater, and it is necessary that we hold ourselves to a high standard and look and have a vision for the future that is well beyond where we are today. But we have work to do to get there. We have to build a bridge, right? And that as the saying goes, we can't let perfection be the enemy of progress.
Yeah.
And so, let's celebrate progress where it happens, and then continue to drive accountability that bar continues to raise. But if somebody takes a huge leap forward to the point where they're literally leading an entire industry and category and doing something that so many others have failed to do or don't have the courage to do because it is challenging to their economics or whatever other measure, but they're not perfect in every other way that we'd prefer they be, and we attack them for it, we're not going anywhere.
Yeah.
How big is the educating restaurants and these other grocery stores on your guys' message? Because they're really interfacing with a customer as well. And it's almost, it's great to see, a restaurant like Hop Daddy having Force of Nature beef there. And, I think if they're able to champion your guys' message as well, it's like, oh my gosh, there's so much potential for this to grow quickly.
Hop Daddy has Force of Nature bison. And Hop Daddy is an incredible example in the food service industry. Those guys are endeavoring to, at some point, they'd like for their entire supply chain to be regenerative, right? And there's not a whole lot of folks we're talking to that have put their money where their mouth is and made such a bold claim. And so props and kudos to them for really doing what's right, not doing what's easy. It's way easier just to, especially in the economic climate we're facing right now, who's welcoming increased prices and costs, eating the difference so they don't pass it through to consumers, to do the right thing. Man, I have a hard time finding other examples of folks that are doing more and better than that, right? So kudos to them, and they're incredible partners, incredible advocates for their consumers. Part of that was, they did a survey of their consumers, and those consumers said, "Hey, I thought all bison were grass fed." And it's like, well, shit, no, they're not. Most bison are not grass fed. If you think you're getting grass fed bison, you probably aren't, unless it says grass fed and they're openly telling the story behind it. And it's like, well, we don't want to take advantage of their misunderstanding. So let's do the right thing. Give them what they're expecting, what they think they're getting. So again, not a lot of folks do the right thing, even when they're not getting credit for it. They're an example of it. I think grocery stores, early in our history, it was a challenge. The interesting thing about grocery is the driver of traffic into stores is quality meat and produce. People don't historically speaking, and still at present, they're not necessarily just going for the boxes in the center, although that has a huge place in the basket. They want the best meat and produce, because it is. Many people are still largely buying vegetables and meat, and that's part of the reason why we've seen the race to the bottom on price, right? Oh well, if nothing else is relevant, then we have to have the lowest price, and then that becomes a singular focus in the race to the bottom, where the only thing that matters is how cheap is it. And when the only thing that matters is how cheap is it, by any means necessary becomes the approach, and you begin to compromise all of the things we've been talking about, and all of the externalities get swept under the rugs, and the truth gets veiled, and you end up with a system that in no way represents what the average consumer would actually construct and hope and want to be supporting. But that's where we are. And I think, I think to vegetables and crop agriculture is getting a free pass right now, and it should not. I think its day is coming. But I think, right now, again, meat has been under attack and in many cases for the right reasons, in many cases for wrong reasons. But, meat's real important when 98% of houses in the country are looking for it. Right. And so I think a lot of grocery stores are looking to it's hard to break old habits. And so they still have that, but they're also recognizing that there's a rapidly growing interest in higher attribute meat and regenerative meat and grass-fed and better welfare. And you start to see those things represented in claims and stuff. And grass-fed meat is growing at 2.5 times, non-grass-fed meat's growing at, and things like that. And so they see the trends and they recognize, okay, well, we want to continue to have foot traffic in our stores at an age where there's a lot of other reasons why it's harder to get foot traffic because there's e-commerce platforms and other things coming out. We better have a better message, and we better be able to serve a broader base. And so, we're seeing more acceptance and appreciation from in retail as well. I think food service is sort of a harder path to do that, which is why it's so great to have partners like we've talked about, because you look at the menu, like the margins are really difficult in food service. They have to mark they have to mark up the product a lot, but they have a lot of costs, and so it's not like they're getting fat and happy just with these markups. They're just trying to cover their bases and keep their doors open. And it's really hard, like when you go to a grocery store, it's hard to tell a story, and that's what you use the packaging for, and you use the branding, and you have all of the P's that you work with in the marketing world but you can make claims, and you can put beautiful imagery on there, and you can write romance copy and highlight certain features and attributes. You can't do that on a one row on a menu.
Right.
And so it's really difficult for them to get credit for improving their supply chain unless they're savvy and they have social and really good marketing and team. And that's not the case for a lot of restaurants. And so to me, it's like a more challenging frontier. And it's, again, half of the market. I think restaurant revenue is about the same as retail revenue, right? And so we have a whole lot of opportunity and potential there. How do we help restaurants, and how do we to tell that story and to get credit for that story? And how do we, again, empower and create awareness with consumers so that they seek out those restaurants that are doing the right thing and reward them for those choices, especially when I think so many, historically and internationally, like so much really good food, and most restaurants are here to want to make really good food. Comes back to really high quality ingredients. And again, like this somehow in this reductionist American mindset, trying to drive prices down, we've lost touch with quality as something that we want to pay value for or give value to.
Yeah, the concept of ordering meat at a grocery store is very interesting because, to your point, it is so hard to verify where the product is actually coming from with all these labeling laws and loopholes and marketing and packages. It's like you think you're getting grass-fed beef, but it's probably finished in grain because that's what we've allowed for. And when you try and go ask the butcher behind the counter, it's like, every time I go to a Whole Foods and try and ask a butcher to verify whether it's grass-fed, grass-finished, I haven't been able to get a very clear answer. And so for me, I love going to a Whole Foods and being able to see force of nature meat there because I actually know it's a verified source and I know what you guys are doing. I know it's just, it's almost like the ultimate insurance for me when I'm buying meat, and you just hope that we can get to a point where more grocery stores are able to carry your products or other brands that are doing things the right way, because it's just a big guessing game for the end consumer right now.
Yeah. And that again, that points back to and is part of that system I was explaining, right? Behind the service case where the butcher stands, you don't see a lot of brands and labels, right? Again, there's an incentive for grocers to want the consumer to believe that the only and best place to get those cuts is from their location. That's part of the rise of private label. You know what I mean? And it's part of and it has led to pulling the curtains over the eyes of consumers, right? They're all getting it from JBS. It's the same stuff.
Yeah.
It doesn't matter if it's this grocer or that grocer or the other grocer. And again, not to call anybody out, right? I mean, certain groups absolutely do better than others, but by and large, it's more often than not coming from, you can't compare Whole Foods to a super conventional place, right? Those would truly be different, but on par. The high-end natural stores are largely coming from similar places, and the super cheap conventional places are largely coming from the same places. There's no difference. They just don't want you to know there's no difference, so they want to be able to label. And I think the food revolution that occurred in the center of the store, where brands started to gain prominence because consumers started to want to consume and purchase brands that were telling a story that aligned with their value. They felt, and I think part of it is being starved for a connection to your food too, right? So it's like, hey, I relate to this. I believe in this. I'm excited about this. I think this is important. I like what that brand is about. I like what they're doing. I like the claims that they're making and the system they're trying to build and the work that they're investing in. I'm going to support that. And I think that's more recently, over the last 5 to 10 years, starting to permeate into the perimeter of the store. The perimeter of the store is where all the commodities are. The meat, the produce, all of those sorts of things, right? And I always say commodification has resulted in the celebration of price above all else at the expense of all else. And I think this revolution of brand and connection to food and the story behind it and the truth behind it, infiltrating that perimeter, is helping to break some of that, break up some of that old way of doing business. And I think a lot more folks are recognizing that, hey, we want to have these brands represented in our set so that we can benefit from the halo effect that the good work that they're doing and that we deserve and should desire to be a part of, and certainly our consumers want, right? So we should give them that.
I can't help but think about White Oak Pastures right now, because they just announced that they're moving out of Whole Foods, but I feel like it almost speaks to exactly what you're talking about, where their brand isn't really represented in the store. So them being able to rely more heavily on their direct-to-consumer model, where people can see, hey, this is a White Oak Pastures piece of beef. You're getting it directly from Bluffton, Georgia, as opposed to, you show up to Whole Foods and like it's just another box of ground beef. Whereas you guys, your label is on that beef and it's clearly represented in the store. You're able to actually interface with the consumer because your brand is there. It's interesting, like, two of the bigger players in the space are kind of making different moves at the same time, but it speaks to that, you need to have the brand representation, or it's not really worth it for someone like White Oak Pastures to be in a Whole Foods.
Yeah, and I think you need to have different models.
Yeah.
Right. Like our model is totally different than White Oak. We work with White Oak, and Will's, when I said before we started Force of Nature, I talked to mentors. I called Will. Will's one of the first people. Actually, Will might be the first person we called.
Wow.
To say, hey, does this make sense to you, or is this going to be fucked up? But Will's, it's I think diversity, right? Like, I mean, it's a lesson that we take from nature. It matters, right? I mean, I think him doing what he's doing is inspiring other people that have the opportunity and potential to do what he's doing to do it. But not everybody can. And I think what we're trying to be is a little bit different than that, and create a different set of solutions by coming at it from a different angle, but be part of the same fight and recognize that, our circles will overlap, even though they may not be, totally one on top of the other. But yeah, I mean, I think we got to find ways for, whether it's us or them or many, there's so many others that you could list out, to be able to realize their goals and fulfill their potential and be an important part. I mean, again, when we look to nature and we look at the complexity of how everything works together in harmony, like, shouldn't our food system be somewhat like that? Why does it have to be so homogenized?
Yes.
Shouldn't.
Yeah. What are you the most proud of about everything that the team has built out so far? I know you obviously have huge goals, and there's still many more chapters to come, but so far up to this point, what are you the most proud of it?
I think probably just doing it in the way and at the time we've done it. I mean, I think I have in jest told friends and investors of ours, like, it should be the butt of a joke, or the punchline of a joke, excuse me, to say that you started a business in mid 2019.
Seriously.
I mean, it's like the last few years have just been outrageous. And I think most people understand that, but unless you're in business, you probably don't appreciate just how challenging the last, year and a half or 2 years has been, specifically with labor markets going sideways and supply chains failing globally and logistics networks absolutely being completely inept at getting anything picked up on time or delivered from point A to point B, and inflation skyrocketing beyond what anybody could have ever imagined. And, it's just been really difficult. And so, I think I'm most proud of how we've been able to navigate that environment and how our team has grown and developed and really fought through that challenge and adversity to produce what we kind of led off talking about, right? Like we really are starting to come into our own and realize that we're having a positive impact in the way that we had hoped, from in the ways of creating awareness with consumers and creating access to better protein, and creating a rising tide, and working with more producers and impacting more land, and getting involved in more species, and addressing different issues. Not all of the issues, but different issues with each of them. And so it's like, I'm certainly proud of that. I'm certainly proud of what we've been able to do, but I'm especially proud of the time in which we've been able to do it and the team that we've been able to put together in the process.
Were there any lessons from you as a steward and head of a business going through that period in 2020 when things were incredibly uncertain? COVID is kind of a black box. No one knows what's going on. People are being told they aren't going to be able to go into the office. Is there anything that you have just from a business perspective, takeaways that really stand out and make you think about how you want to build the business going into the future?
It's a good question. I guess I hadn't thought a ton about that. I guess it's business and life together, right? I mean, when do you make a career change? When do you have a kid? When do you start a business? Like, it's never going to be convenient or easy, and like, just one of our core values is, do hard things. And I think I don't think we envisioned it playing out the way that it has necessarily.
Yeah.
But
careful what you ask for.
Yeah, right. But I think nobody's going to do it for you. It's never going to fall into place. The success stories weren't like overnight. That we all hear and romanticize weren't just these overnight things that fell into place. Like there's always struggle, and the ability to just face that challenge head on and to persevere through it and to work really hard because you believe in something, and frankly, to make sure that your why behind what you're doing is truly filled with purpose and mission. I think that's been really key to us being able to make it through and overcome what was been thrown our way in the way that we have, right? I mean, again, it's a real shit sandwich that so many folks got served over the last few years. And I think a lot of folks just said, fuck that, I'm out. And I think our team was able to say, you know what, this is worth it. We're going to dig our heels in. We're going to work harder than anybody else. And we're going to do the things that nobody else is willing to do. And we'll be patient and rethink and pivot and shift and do all the things that we need to do. And so I think, just recognizing that nobody's going to bail you out. Nobody's going to do it for you. Just like, you got to own it and do it yourself. And whether that's your family and your home life, your own personal goals, or whether it's a business or a job or a role that you're in, you have the reins. Your destiny is exclusively in your control, and other people can influence that, but they can't stop you. And if you work at it hard enough and push hard enough, like, you'll get where you want to go.
Yeah, your guys' brand name is pretty appropriate for that message.
Yeah. I mean, I think on that point, that brand, that messaging, that mission, that what you're talking about, I think that comes through so clearly in the product that you guys put out. But also, we've been fortunate because we've gotten to actually become friends and colleagues with a lot of the people in the Force of Nature team, and are just beyond impressed by everything that you all are doing. And there's such a strong mission behind that. There's a voice, and we feel that, and we're just very appreciative that companies like Force of Nature exist. So I just wanted to thank you for everything that you're doing. And also just thank you for coming on the show to talk to us, because it's just been awesome for us to get to pick your brain and get to become friends with you. It's really special, and we appreciate that.
Yeah. And both of you, I mean, I appreciate it, right? I mean, you guys, again, thank you. We can't do what we do and what we're trying and endeavoring to do without opportunities like this to go out and expand it, right? And I can't tell you enough how important it is that our ecosystem includes folks like you that are willing to take on the fight and do the hard work that you do and help us and contribute to what we're working on. So thank you both as well.
Yeah, appreciate it. Thanks, Robby.